Hello, good morning. Very warm welcome to Hanoi. My name is Oliver. I am the director. I think it's fine. Right? Okay, sorry. Yeah. So good morning, everyone at the Goethe Institute Hanoi. My name is Oliver, and I am the director of the institute. I warmly welcome our partners, Hanoi ad hoc and Haus der Kultur in der Welt, HKW, from Berlin, and all the participants to the second day of the workshop. Dealing with colonial legacy is complex and often a contradictory process. So I'm extremely happy to host you, dear partners and dear participants, for this ambitious workshop. The Goethe Institute is a German cultural institute active worldwide. We work to promote German and encourage intercultural cultural exchange. Post-colonialism and fair culture is one of our strategic topics that we focus on because we think it's highly relevant for the context in Vietnam. Together and always together with local partners and civil society organizations, we want to strengthen the dialogue with European partners. With our activities in this field, we want to stimulate rereading and rethinking of history, as you do, of course, during the workshop. On the one hand, it's a way back to the past, but on the other, it's the best way to connect with the present and the future to establish a culture of fairness in European Vietnamese collaboration. Socialist housing, a signature of Vietnam, is part of history of architecture, which carries many aspects of post-colonialism. The Goethe Institute cooperates with our local partners to communicate with a wider audience social issues through creative and artistic formats. So that's why within this framework of this cooperation, we support the production of a documentary, and I'm very happy that you, the participants, are the key persons who will contribute your knowledge, your experience, your creative materials to the success to this film, Chuk My Man. So I hope will be a great film at the end, and you will have many inspiring encounters. I would like to thank again the partners, so Haus der Kultur in der Welt, especially Rosa and Emilienne, and of course Atok and Chung for all the preparation. So great pleasure for us being part of this ambitious project. So now I wish everyone very interesting day, and I'm sure I will join you later these days if you have kind of some summaries. I just was in Germany for 1 month in my holiday, so this is really the very beginning, and it's a very energetic and inspiring beginning, and wish you a great time here in Hanoi with this workshop. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. I'm going to launch right in, and I'm going to ask if somebody could let me know once we hit about 10. Okay, give me like the sign up. Okay, we got time, but all right. I'll introduce myself in a minute by the next slide, but I just want to start by talking about this slide. This is a commemorative stamp of the Utopias, Kim Lien, which we're going to be visiting today. I'm going to start my talk just a little bit about. We're going to come back in the end, but I'm using it as an example because you don't just produce a stamp about anything; it has to be kind of important, right? So there's a whole symbolism behind why at this time. I know most of you in the room are probably not even knowing what sou is, right? And so if you can imagine 100 sou equaling a dome, right? I mean, this doesn't even exist anymore, like giving inflation, right? So we're talking about like the very, very early 1960s. But this is like, aspirational housing, right? And that's at the center of my work. Aspirational housing that I have to want to emphasize is born out of the ruins of warfare. We cannot forget that historical context of warfare and the need for housing for people who lost housing because of American bombing and annihilation of cities, but also because of mass industrialization, right? As we heard that Manuel was talking about yesterday, which then we need workers at the time, right? Vietnam needed workers. And that is then workers who were coming from the countryside. The vast majority of them were women, right? Because although the women were being tiny and Hong in the war, many of the men, especially rural men, were sent to the front, right? So this becomes a very kind of gendered project. I want to set that out there at the very, very beginning. And the goal of which we want to remember is to provide a quote unquote good life, right? And so Kim Lien, it becomes the symbol of that future. It's very, very different than where you were yesterday, although they were built at the same time. Kim Lien starting 1959, Kim Lien being supported by North Korea. You're going to see that in some of the images. And I love that, Emmanuel, yesterday you were talking about modernity, right? That this is so connected with modernity. What I'm going to do today is for us to ask the question, whose modernity, right? There are many kinds of modernities, right? So we want, and what kind of modernity? And I ask that because there's a whole, these, Utopias in general was very much embodied in an ideology, a whole new way of organizing society, right? What we call is the social organization, okay? So it was about how to produce certain kinds of people, socialist people, right? That's very important, right? But what do those persons look like, right? So this is very people-oriented design, which is very different from the design we have today, right? We're going to look at that as we move through. So I want to kind of put out there the ways in which you're going to see from Witten Kong Chu yesterday, which was built around a kind of Chinese model. Now, the Chinese were not involved directly in building it. It was built around a kind of Chinese model, the Danwei model. I'll talk a little bit about in a minute. And then we had the Kim Lien model that was built with the assistance of North Korea, who was strongly influenced by the Soviet Union at that time. We're talking about competing ideologies about how to organize society, right? And how to house people, one being more communal influence emphasis. Like you were yesterday in buildings that were communal, right? Where you had one right? And Basing on every floor. Kim Lien broke with that model and emphasized the nuclear family. And the Vietnamese government was not really happy about that. Okay, we're going to talk about that. These kinds of tensions that played out through construction. Okay, so just real briefly, because I know I jumped in, I didn't even tell you who I was. So I'm Christina Schwenkel. I'm a professor of I was going to say architecture, but that's not true. Anthropology, who works on architecture, and I look at the relationship between Germany, who helped to build one of the largest and most symbolic Utopias in Vietnam, was built in Vietnam. Okay, and it became then the kind of model for how to build an organized society at that time. And so I've worked here for the last 15, 20 years for quality, skills, and religion. We'll talk about that because that really raises question I know that you raised too about like what is the value of social heritage here. Okay, this is my book. It's going to be open access soon, so I'm hoping like all of you will be able to access it because that's always been my goal is to have access to Vietnam. But my other goal is to have it translated even but 5 minutes it takes a long time, so that's in process. But anyways, this is the model at the time being, I'm going to talk about that today. We're going to start looking at it, and I know there are a lot of differences of model socialist planning for the time, okay? And then the mass housing after Bing's annihilation, right? And housing them was seen as a way for Bing, right? Bing's not Hanoi, right? Everyone always thinks of Bing as being a little more backwards than Hanoi. Bing was going to catch up and it was going to surpass Hanoi, and it was going to show itself to be a modern industrial future for all of Vietnam and South, right? So the really important project with a vision around East Germany. And it represents what I titled my talk today, Unfinished Utopias, right? I'll get into why that was, because that's going to be an ongoing theme. But it really forms the basis. Here is one of the most symbolic housing there. It forms the basis. If you're looking at, you see some green, you see, kind of some design, you see some ventilation in the way in which it was designed. Also see people intervention. So I'm using this as a start to introduce who I am, but also because I want to talk to you about 5 provocations I have for today. But one of the first things I want to say to you is my advice here. If you want to understand a utopia, live in it, right? You have to live in it. So as an anthropologist, my methodology was to move in and live in the utopia. I'll show you my apartment in just a moment, right? And only through that, we have a sensory activity plan today. It's only when you are in the utopia daily, right? Participate in everyday life that you feel it, you smell it, you hear it, you see it, right? So that kind of larger sensory environment allows you then to really get into and understand how utopias work and where they were successful in the right? And also to understand my 5 provocations that I have here. Whoops. I'm calling them myth busting. We're going to do some myth busting about utopia because these myths are all over the place. All you need to do is open the newspaper, right? And you'll see constant complaints about the flip-flop, the quenoi, or the, I guess the translate is tiger cages, which is a controversial term, by the way, because people were put in tiger cages to torture you now during the war, right? So there's the problem. Wow. Okay, number 1, utopia are not uniform construction. People love to say that about modernist architecture, right? It's gray and it's uniform. We're going to challenge that. That's provocation 1. Number 2, utopia are not concrete jungles. That's another huge stereotype, especially of socialist housing, right? Now, I'm going to make another argument that is the original green design. Okay, that's provocation 2. Number 3, utopia are not sites of social alienation. That's another huge myth that we have about modernist housing, right? It cuts people off. They can't communicate with one another, right? The anomie that emerges because of socialist modernist housing, right? No, actually, all you need to do is spend 5 minutes at every utopia to see that that's not the way through. I think you saw that yesterday. I already heard that it was a very intense experience for you. That's because it is so socially vibrant, right? It's so much going on and you had sensory overload, right? That you'll see right away that these are not sites of sociality. They're intense sites of sociality. Okay, and then residents are not to blame for utopia decay. Everyone loves to talk about utopia decay, right? To top, right? We all know that some of them have deteriorated up to 80% of their structural capacity. Some of them are dangerous to live in, okay? But yes, we can't keep blaming the people who live in them, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about that. We have time to get there. And then I do want to emphasize the debates that are going on today about socialist architecture as being instrumental to urban memory, and also that they do have heritage value. Right? So the question then is, how do you preserve them? And that's an ongoing debate that's going on. And it's been an ongoing debate in Bing where I do my work. Well, so we're going to consider these kinds of provocations when we visit Canadian today. Okay. All right. So let's start with provocation number 1. Okay. Oh, by the way, those kinds of provocations, those kinds of myths, right, provide fodder for the argument to demolish and remove utopia from the landscape, right? So that's why it's really important that we resist those myths, right, and really think about the future of utopia, because it's too easy to say, take them down, destroy communities, destroy livelihood practices, and reproduce and replace them with new models, right? And we're going to be looking at how those new models are not green design. They do not facilitate the same kinds of social interactions, because remember, utopia were built with a specific ideology to have people-oriented design, right? To produce productive workers, right? If you have productive workers, you can then build society. This is about nation building, right? Socialist nation building at a particular time when Vietnam felt it needed to catch up with the rest of the world because it had been devastated by French colonization, who extracted its resources for the benefit of France, right, for the metropole. and also then Americans who felt they should come in and bomb everything, right? So we're talking about really starting from the ground, rebuilding infrastructure and modernization and industrialization, okay? And so it's very people-oriented design. So what can we do to build spaces that will produce productive workers? That's the whole ideology beyond that. But because I called it unfinished utopias, we want to be thinking about the difference between the aspiration and the reality, right? Okay, so here we go. But this is the apartment block that I lived in, right? And so when you look at this, and I show this to people around, different places in the world, all my friends in Eastern Europe and Eastern Germany, people are like, I lived in a place that looked just like that, right? People have these, people, hey, that looks like where I grew up, these sorts of things. So we have this way in which there's this, oh, we see some similarities. Of course, there were similarities, right? There are these, as Emmanuel talked about yesterday, these kinds of ways of thinking about form that were circulating around the world at the time in socialist countries, right? But why I said you gotta live there? Because once you get in there, right, get in on the ground, like move from the bird's eye view into these places, it's the diversity is just absolutely incredible. And I'm not just talking about the size, I'm also thinking about the inside of this too, right? So I'll give you just a little like showing you the inside of my apartment where I lived for 9 months, living there, participating in society, doing surveys, interviews, map surveys of the entire site. Just a quick here, you'll see how it, and it's not just about interior design. Okay, we know everybody does their interior design differently, right? But what was important here is like people were challenging top-down planning, right, and totally redesigning their apartments, right? And part of it, and in those cases, part of it had to do with like removing load-bearing walls, right? Moving doors, creating whole new spaces in addition to the koinoi, right? The koinoi we see, but once you're inside, you can see the incredible work that people have done. Opening floors in the opening holes in the floor so they connect 2 floors, right? They can totally reconfigure the space. Okay, whether it's safe or not, we can ask some of the engineers. Okay, but this is the way to use in terms of the design. Okay, you can see things like this, talking about altars that were, and altars are funky, right? You have to set them up a certain way. This construction wasn't set up to accommodate altars, so people had to rearrange. You can't put your altar out, right? You got to rearrange the house, right? So they move doors around and you windows. All these ways when you're inside, you see the incredible things. Not to mention that the typology is different, but we'll come back to that. My point being here that people introduce in the design of their living space, right? That really challenges the idea of top-down planning, okay? And that we want to be thinking about what happens in environment. People are not passive residents that just sit at home and kind of move in and leave it. They're very, very active into it now. And that's an important point because when people are talking about the history of socialist architecture and socialism itself, people always talk about like the surveillance state and that people have no room to move around and they were controlled subjects. And, that's not true, right? And then every time you see on the ground the ways in which people work with and actually resist state and accommodate the state, but then change. Okay, so you want to see people as active users. I even call them like designers who are involved in this process. Okay, all right. By the way, as I mentioned, KTT, one of the largest KTT mutual ran, as Emmanuel talked to you about where the mutual ran is from yesterday, with collaborations with the UDR, which is a few flags that were up there at the time. Now, each building had a different facade. Each building had a different identity because each building was allocated to a different group of workers or cadres. This completely influenced the way in which the cultural life played out, but it also challenged, there was at the time this idea that KTT would be the great social equalizer, right? Everybody's going to live in KTT. Everybody's going to have within 18 square meters or 34 square meters. But once I started living in it, it became obvious right off the bat, this was not the great social equalizer. In fact, because they were able to, through allocation history, to reproduce gratification. And also, as I'll talk about just a little bit, in terms of gender inequality. Remember, one of the goals of socialism was to eradicate gender inequality, and the revolution made huge steps forward to make gender, eradicate most fetal practices that had protected women, right? So we have to say here, we're one way forward to make men and women more equal. And so the stratification that emerged that only saw living in the apartment and mapping out who was assigned where, right? And then you're able to see that it actually was not the great social equalizer that it. Okay.
one of the things that was really important in a way of organizing society was planning. You guys are architects and urban, you know planning, right? And you would probably like, yeah, of course you plan, right? At that time, planning was new. People didn't plan. We had spontaneous urbanization going on here, right? Especially after the war. People could claim spots, build homes, and that was their land, right? You had the spontaneity. And so when the East Germans came in this collaborative atmosphere to design and rebuild things, they saw all this kind of like how it was land up for grabs and what they saw as chaos, right? So they wanted this idea of imposing order on space became really important. Also important here. So you have functional planning that emerged for the first time. This became a model for other places in Vietnam for having functional planning. That is the separation of industry from living, from green spaces, from agriculture, whereas before it had been integrated. Okay, and that's really important because that was part of the Chinese model that was structured space at the time. The workplace model, the downward, where people worked on site at the factory, for example, the cement factory, which has been originally built, a regional factory, with the support of China in the 1950s, when workers lived on site. They also had access to land on site where they would then do their emphasis on self-sufficiency, right? So then they had access land on site. Everything was part of the downward site right there. And so when the DDR came in, this is very much a Soviet ideology as well. They challenged that model, right? And so, no, we have to separate. People should not be living on the site, especially industrial sites that pollute them. We need to disentangle, right? We need to disentangle. Industry should be outside the city. Living should be on one side of the city. Health should be next to where people live. Okay, so they really tried to disentangle what at the time in Vietnam, had been entangled. Now, interestingly enough, they also wanted to disentangle living in commerce, which we know in Vietnam is entangled, right? All you do is walk down the street and you see somebody's house in the bottom is the commerce, right? So this was ways in which they also not only challenging state models, the Vietnamese state models of organization, but they started challenging cultural models of living. And that's where you also, then you had the Vietnamese state resistant. The Vietnamese state wasn't ready to move to the nuclear family, individual housing level, right? They were still, this is the, or they're pointing out that, the country between China that was influencing what side we're going to go on. Are we going to move to the communal? Are we going to stay with the communal? Are we going to move more towards the individual, influenced by the kind of liberal self ideology that was also present in socialist peace? Okay, these tensions are now playing out as they're here, and then people are resisting this idea that the living space would be separated from cultural spaces and from economic spaces. Okay, so then what you see is after you have the planning, people then changing the planning and merging those sectors that was okay. I just want to also bring out something, so new way of planning and organizing society. Not everybody was on board, right? Okay. And there we see those competing ideologies. Incidentally, the Utopias and Ding, right, were built by women. Okay, very, very important here. 80% of the construction industry, from quarrying to bricklaying to cement work, on and on and on, they were performed by women. It's super important. People don't talk about that, right? But all you need to do in Vietnam is go out on the road, keep building the road. Women, right? So women are the laborers of infrastructure. That's so important that we acknowledge that. And it wasn't only in Vinh, by the way. When it's not profit, you often hear people say, "Oh, did you see the profit in Vinh?" No, it's not profit. It's brick housing, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. Okay. So also in Hanoi, construction by women, huge representation of women in buildings. We have to see that, right? The labor of infrastructure, the labor of, incidentally, something else I want to put here, if you were close to here, they are involved in precasting, right? Look at the precasting is done on site, okay? It's not being done in concrete factories because there goes back to the unfinished utopia, right? And the aspiration versus the reality. Okay, because the aspiration was to build concrete factories, the reality was those factories were too ambitious, and there was no infrastructure to support the infrastructure of cement or of concrete. Okay, so I want to say something really quickly about this because this is really fascinating. I don't hear people talk about this enough. Yeah, these first Gothenburg, right, which is the large panel factory that was built in Vietnam with the goal to build 1,000 apartments per year, was built by East Germany in the 1970s in Dap, which is about 50 kilometers north of Hanoi. Okay, with the bombing of the Americans, they started up again in 1972. By the way, then they never stopped. In Hanoi, there was they had to stop the project, and it was finally finished in 1973. People often say that the first large panel factory was the Russians, the Soviets, right? No, they came after. It was actually the Eastern. So this is really important. But the problem was they had all these things, they built the factory, but there were no roads, right? Roads had been bombed. Okay. There was no steel. You need steel, right? To build there. So there are all these ways in which the ambition and the reality can contradict one another. Okay. It didn't allow for the factory to be in full use at the time. Okay. They also built then a big concrete factory in Ving as well. And they had the same problem. So then the women were then on site doing the pre-casting on site in wooden frames. Okay, so again, the aspiration versus the reality is quite different. But this is an ongoing kind of joke in Vietnam. Actually, I love this cartoon here. There are so many cartoons, and many of you brought around some great ones too about profit, down housing, right? That's it. And I just didn't say like, well, I'm going to do my brickwork and take a nap and dream about like being able to use large panel because we can't, right? Even though we built these factories, right, and we've got them now, but we can't. So this is kind of the tension, and again, the unfinished utopian aspiration here. Okay. Oh, okay. So generally, because women were the workers, they were allocated the housing. This is, I find fascinating when we did the survey of the 15,000 people who live in KTT. Look at the number of percentage of women who received user rights. That is, that the apartments were allocated to women workers, right? Look at that, up to 70, 80, almost 80%, right? And these numbers are probably higher, right? Given the kind of limitations from the survey. Now, over about 2/3 of the original occupants are still living in England. I've doing the survey since 2011, right? So women are overwhelmingly those who have user rights. So when privatization occurred at PKP beginning in 1992, right? The CP61, and then it was much later, it wasn't until 2010 when I was doing my research. That meant that women became the legal homeowners. Okay, that's super important, right? Because you don't find that in a lot of other countries, okay? Because it gives women certain rights, right? And also financial security that they make. So this is another country. Where did you really have low numbers? P2, 50%. I live in P2, that was that was for professors, and it was for managers and Humboldt, right? And the managers were predominantly men. Okay, so what I was able to do is to map out on the rooftop pay the kind of gender division of labor and how that impacted then the allocation of the apartment buildings. And it was no surprise that the apartment buildings that were allocated to men who were managers in Humboldt, right, were the ones that were the least. Okay, that means that they received, the women in the worker housing received the least amount of funds to maintain the structure. And in the end, that's an important point because the pay, and you can read about this even in Professor Peters, is often blamed on women, right? Rural women workers who came into working industry, were given modern apartments, and didn't know how to live in a modern home, right? So, for example, they threw chopsticks down the drain, they threw their garbage in the toilets, they did all these things because they just were too village, had a village mentality, right? They're humble, right? We're trained overseas, they knew how to be modern, right? So there's this kind of tension, right? And of course, in Vietnam, historically, women are always seen as the doctors, right? So this becomes part of that discourse that the pay then is blamed on women who didn't know how to live in housing. This is an ongoing trope around the world in social housing in the United States where I'm from, right? You talked yesterday about Eagle Pruitt and the demolition. Well, they demolished it because it was so decayed. And guess who was responsible for that? Totally Black people, right? Not saying no, it was the state who didn't invest the money to maintain the housing, right? Same kind of discourse in Australia with the indigenous people as well. They don't know how to live in modern music, right? So that they're the ones who are responsible for the history of housing. Right? So we need to really question these kinds of narratives, right? And it comes back to the idea of who is to blame them for the case, for what I kind of unplanned obstacles. Okay, much more complicated story there. And that's the kind of history of the U.S. and Australia. Here we go. Let's talk about these typologies. You can see there are diverse typologies here. This is important too because the ways in which we have two different types. So here we have families, unit union, where you have two families living together and then they would share, right? They would share one bathroom and one kitchen. Okay. So what we're going to see in Kimlian, then you had the dormitory style that you saw yesterday in Peru, right? Where everybody just has one room. Okay. Sometimes more than one family had one room during the war time because there was not enough housing. Remember, this is also about trying to find housing for as many people as possible in a time where there is not that infrastructure. And then there would be one Nabep and one Nabesi on every floor. Okay, you can still see that in Peru. I don't know if anybody even saw that, right? But then some families try to build their own for the first after 50 years. It doesn't really like that. Okay, we have it, and then just for like people who were single often. Okay, then you had the double family here, where the family could then share two families using one bathroom room and have it same in the house. And as you mentioned, yesterday, people did not often didn't want to have bathroom in the house and everything in the house either. Okay, because they wanted that outside, right? Because it was bad funky, especially when you're inside a really small apartment, right? There's no way you can hang up an altar in a big place if you've got the toilet that's right there. And then here, this is what the PDR is, right? The team, we call it, right? The team, that's on where one is a very nuclear family oriented model. One family, one apartment, their own bed, their own everything, right? And at that time, and that's how they built Kimlian. Okay, that's how the North Koreans built Kimlian. And Kimlian, by the way, was not both. And you'll see that when you read the tour guide today, that's the public about that. They were fairly high-ranking and successful scientists and artists at that time. So they were going to be getting one apartment per family. And so the state came in and said, oh no, we're not doing that. We're going back to this model, right? The family model. Okay. So then what they did was they took their partners and Kimlian was set up very differently. You walk in, you got a small kitchen in the basement, you have a sink in front, and then you got one room. Right. So then they allocated each room to a family. So they took the model that should have been 15, one nuclear family, and then divided it into two. Okay. And this was a tension in Zing with the PDR designers as well, because they took all the apartments that had been designed for one family and they divided them and gave them to two. And the PDR engineers at the time said, you can't do that. We built it for the structure for 80 families. Now you're putting in 160 families. They're going to take quickly. And those are the ones that actually did take quickly, but they were still standing as a piece to the top. Okay, so you have different kinds of housing technology, and that's where a lot of the tension was coming out between the communal versus the individual. Well, at the same time, we want to see that, for example, the three was very influenced by the Soviet Union at that time, right? So that idea of the emphasis on the nuclear family is very Eurocentric because Vietnam is not family oriented, right? It's oriented towards 3 generations, sometimes 4 generations, right? So that was also kind of a tension there. It's not even accommodating some of the social practices in Vietnam. Okay. So I want to show you real quickly, going back to my provocation, that there's a lot more diversity in the ways in which people themselves then intervene in the space. So opening up the floor so they can have access to these stores and the needs. Here, this is where the toilet was. We walk in, we have a toilet. We're super embarrassed about that, right? They just have that horrible design. At least the guest entering the house had a bad smell, right? So that they closed the door here so that you wouldn't see it. Sometimes they just move the toilet to the back of the house. All these ways in being designed to try to make it fit how they thought that their lifestyle should be, and if it was Koinoi, everybody loves Koinoi, right? Like the Utopias are the most famous Koinoi. Part of the study that I did was to investigate how they built the Koinoi, work with the designer who was building the Koinoi. That was so fascinating. And to investigate and research each Koinoi and what people do with the Koinoi. And so that was really fascinating. I'm not going to show you everything, but there, Koinonia are fascinating too, because they changed the idea of public-private, because this is Koinonia are private spaces. So at the front of the house, it's open and people kind of come and go, but in the back of the house, they become private spaces, right? So it also shows a change in perception of what private is in these homes. Because Koinonia are often given to newly married couples that had to live with the parents, right? But they didn't want to live in one room, so they could give them a bit of privacy. That was so interesting. But they did more than that. So very Koinonia things. They were quite actually, right? They were quite beautiful on the inside. So here is a newlywed. They have their own private room. I think it's very this is a other things that they were used for their commerce, right? So some of my colleagues are doing English in them. Of course, they turned them into dining rooms and living rooms. And what I thought was really cool was the theme that we call in the United States man cave, right? That is male space that you don't go in, right? So that was really interesting too, that it kind of like made a difference between feminine space and masculine space that had been much more blended in the household, right? So suddenly men would say they take their bodies and go hang out and do homes, right? Or have some tea, these sorts of spaces, right? So that was a very interesting one as well, right? Usually like in the US it's basements and garages, here it was right? So very creative in house authorities. And when you're in them, you never know that you're hanging over the side, right? It's so sturdy. So the idea, and these cost several $1,000s, by the way, to build. So the idea that they're like signs of poverty and life is just not the case. It's actually people who were the wealthiest in the complex were the ones who had the Koinonia. People who didn't have Koinonia. So it's a very kind of, we have to transform. Okay, let's jump to Hanoi. So Hanoi has Koinonia not on the, they call them backpacks, right? 10 years ago, they called them backpacks. But now in Hanoi, and for a while, they've been building them on the front, right? So front packs, like you carry babies too, right? Front packs and back. So they balance the building because the buildings were shifting. They were so heavy. So here in Hanoi, you've got the front pack, which is quite interesting. You don't have that in, so there are these differences. And then they build on top of the rooftop, right? So then you go from 5 stories to 6 stories. By the way, there's a whole story of how people are permitted to do this, right? And how the kinds of fun, it wasn't that much in vain. It was only like 500,000 buildings, right? So that when the inspector comes, the inspector just says, looks good to me, and goes away, right? So that they can keep it. But that's part of it. They are illegal, right? But they're permitted. And people have a lot of freedom, right? Freedom, because they know that the space that they're living in is quite small, right? Another one I want to show you because we're going to be going to Kinlian today. And Kinlian is really interesting because you have Koinonia built onto Koinonia built onto Koinonia, right? That's quite unique. And what's fabulous about that, and I had a couple of those things, is you can see how the building materials change over time, okay? And it actually indexes how Vietnam's economy changed over time. So when people started building Koinonia, there was only brick, right? And then suddenly they had access to other materials, right? A little bit of metal. And then suddenly they had access to other kinds of materials that were coming up, being imported when the construction market opened, right? Commercially. So you can see those changes. This is a Koinonia in B6 where we're going to go. Maybe we'll even be able to visit the development where the family was allocated this back in the 60s. And he uses it as his studio. And then he has this kind of now space studio. And then there's the kind of like domestic space that the wife and his close up. So that's then the business space and labor you see in the Koinonia. Okay, so moving to this through. Okay, yeah, provocation, green design, which is some of the original green design, right? A huge part of green design at the time was a huge part of socialist housing ideology, especially in Germany, right? Always trying to think about how to create air, how to design buildings so for better ventilation, how to be far enough away from the traffic. So here's an example. Here's an example of the housing area C, right? And all the circles are trees. Notice the spacing between the buildings for ventilation. The buildings are also at an angle. They did all these kinds of measurements of the winds. So, and then you have the Dalao, right? So that the cool winds would come in summer and the warmer winds would come in the winter. right? So it was a natural, climatization, just like a climate system at the time, right? So a lot of, energy being put into the kinds of like studying the climate conditions to produce their own kind of thoughts about their own kind of, I kind of refer to it as the Oriental tropical modernism at the time, right? That they're trying to design. But the thing is, once you stay in there, once you live in it, I can believe how cool to build the apartments are. Constantly wind coming through, right? The design, and part of it had to do with you can see all the things, right? There's a lot of things. So then this kind of staggering patterns, okay? Now the government wasn't too crazy about that. So they took over the last 3 houses. They said, we're going to redesign the last 3 houses. And that's when they said, we're getting rid of your nuclear family model, and we're going to divide it. And we're also going to like not follow your, wind science. So you can see here, like, what's going on? What's going on there? And like, that's the Vietnam housing part, right? That's where the Vietnam state said, no, we're taking over right now. See the difference. And those are these stuffiest housing because they're not designed to put the wind in the same sort of way, right? And they're also 2 families per unit. And people live with 2 families per unit. And still in these cities. Okay, so we're talking about them, 50 years, right? Okay. So, and then this is only area. A lot of emphasis on these. So similar to what we saw yesterday, like this is but again, the difference here because there's much more space was between the okay. So one of the greenest spaces in the city when you go from above and you look at what's also interesting here, well, here's the map going back to the idea of utopias. They only finished building this side they never got to, because this was also a time when the journey themselves, right? They had imported all the cranes, the machinery, everything to build things, right? Because there was no infrastructure in India at that point. They had all the like 30 new factories that they built too. We're talking about every day, right? Huge ships coming into port at Haiphong and putting on small ships to go down to things, right? To bring this out to fill. Well, East Germany ran out of money. And this is like 1980, and we know what's starting to happen in Eastern Europe at that time because of the collapse of the later. Right? So this whole 5 years was not this. Right? So it's part of that kind of like aspiration, it's overly aspirational ambition to build large, but in the end, you have to. So here you can see the design to touch the ventilation in the wings, right? Everything here. And this is sort of again, I guess we're here going back to my house here. You can see how the design is, and this is how Kimlian is, and this is not how Ubuntu is, right? Because you had the hallway in the middle, right? So this is very, very important, right? And here you have the hallway in the front, and then from the front hallway, then the apartments go back. That means you have a lease built through. And you're going to see in Kimlian B, where we're going to be today, designed in the North Korean style, is built like this. Second part of Kimlian we're going to take you to is not built like that. We built the central hallway. And so that's what we're going to do with the field assignment, something signed in there. You're going to even feel it, the embodiment of like, if you're in the 30 seconds and you start sweating with the other one, you're feeling very cool, you can feel the breeze. So that's part of it too. How you experience the design itself. That's part of the sensory mapping. Quite exercise we have for you today. Okay. So when they were starting to demolish Hangzhou in Bing and taking them to high rises, especially older people, like, we're not going into those high rises, right? Because they have central staircases. We want to stay in our best designed, most stable building built in Vietnam because of the yeah, they had this kind of fetishization linked to the idea of German technology, right? At the time, they saw them as being, and probably they were right that they were still standing compared to the new construction, which they did not trust at all. Right? All right, and I just want to point this out because part of what I don't see so often here in part of the spatial, the scale, and then you build is huge gardens, right? So then the government allocated gardens between the people share that, and they rotated as well. So it's all the gardens. It's also livestock. There are goats, chickens. There are a whole bunch of things that people are raising, right? So it just has a very kind of almost rural feel, right? That goes back to the idea of the rural village. This is a huge part of how people survive too, right? And they also had gardens. Yeah. Okay. How are we doing for time? No time? Yeah. Okay. So I can let you know. Oh, it is something to look at the discipline information. So we need to grab the buckets and you know, wrap up. And we got a bus waiting, and we got our tour guides when we wait. And so basically, I want to tell you a little real quick social alienation, right? That people tend to be on the East Coast. Just like I don't exist if I'm like one person in this nav housing, but like again, once you're on the ground and you're doing the sensory exercise, you have to answer you guys, right? I mean, it's like, oh my God, it's the most vibrant space ever, right? So like, and you'll experience that today, and I think you saw that yesterday, right? So how can you argue that these spaces are about social alienation, especially in a place like Vietnam, right? And the ways in which you have the commercial areas, you have the sports areas, are parks built everywhere. I didn't say that because remember the ideology is to produce good workers. If you have good workers, they have to rest. That was also a very kind of East German philosophy that was down into too. So each age group had their own kind of park for hanging out, which is also very interesting, in their own kind of clubhouse, right? So that they could regenerate. That was part of the idea, to regenerate. Okay. Lots of social things. I'm not going to say a lot, but I just want to say some points on two, which is just kind of social life is always ongoing. It's loud, right? It's fun. Everybody's happening. It's true. And then that the designers themselves like, oh my gosh, what are the house that we built, right? Because this is like people challenging top-down planning. Okay, so it's just another ongoing, simple but really important point. Okay, all right. And I just want to challenge the myth that like there's this myth. It's a very neoliberal myth, right? That people buy into it. It's like if you don't own your house, you don't care about it, right? If you rent, you don't care. So basically, the idea was, well, if people paid because everyone is in there paying $1.50 in rent, right? And the rent in California was about 13,000 dong and 35,000 dong, right? Highly subsidized. Right? So people don't care about the space, but you'll see people caring for space all over. It's clean space. They organize cleaning activities, right? People are constantly then themselves, because the state doesn't invest a dime into maintenance. People are doing the maintenance themselves, and they organize themselves to come together to do the maintenance. And that was something that was really amazing for me to then kind of see. And then when I would interview the people who were supposed to be doing the maintenance, they'd be like, well, we don't have any money. And like, all these ways in which that they would just kind of shirk their own duties, right? So people took over to say, we're going to take control of our space. So there's a lot of care for people in the space because it's their community. And that's super important, because when then the developers come in and say, we're going to demolish it, right? Then people don't want to demolish it because they're also losing community. That was the point made yesterday as well, right? We've heard that point emphasized, and that is super true. Like, remember, people have been living together. These are groups of people that like were in war together, were living together in thatched houses, communal thatched houses during the wartime, and then moved into these houses and have lived together there. They've known each other since they've been 16. They've lived with each other since they've been 16. Through a lot of hardship, through the for the help, which is super hard for people in Vic, because I just starvation, right? And so they've been through hardships and they still live together. So it's very difficult just to say, we're going to disband that community, right? So as they started demolishing the houses, they came up right away with a great plan that would be on-site settlement, right? Hiding inside title, so that people could live in their community. That's the they could send to the center. They could stay in the center of the city on the most valuable property, and they were able to continue to live in their community, right? And they did so only because they organized the women people. Being there and living there and watching them do that was just incredible, right? So they care for their place. So they just say they don't care because they're not homeowners, right? That's a neoliberal ideology. If you're a homeowner, you care for your place, otherwise you don't. No, right? But yes, they decay, right? So we really want to ask the question of who's responsible for the decay. And that decay is really, really dangerous, okay? And it goes back to that, what's the role of the state maintenance, right? That the state did not invest money, and you can see the story across all the people picked up. I want to end with this. This is a great because the infrastructural neglect, right? They built all this great new infrastructure and then it didn't work, okay? Or they built new infrastructure and then the state said, well, we're gonna dismantle part of it, because we're not going to have the electricity, take away the light bulb, solar light bulb. All these things are happening to the super poor at this time. But this shows us that this is not the great equalizer, right? Because guess what? Who got put on the bottom where there was water and easy access and they didn't have to walk up the stairs? The most important tumble, right? And who got put at the top? The lowest female workers, right? And they had to walk up and down stairs. Now today they're in their 70s. That's super hard, right? As you're getting older. And they were the ones when infrastructure broke, right? That there was no water. So I love this one because it really just shows you, like, you know, who's responsible that there's no water? Well, that's the state problem, right? But it also shows you about that it wasn't the great social equalizer, because people who lived on the first and second floors were considered the highest priority. The higher you went up in the building, right, the less priority that you had. Right? And so living under the ceilings here, those are the ceilings that are falling on people's heads right now, right? The most dangerous, and those just happen to be the poorest people and the people who were then the lowest versus on the building floor. Okay, so this is not about social equality. Okay, so the ending point here is that these are huge debates going on. They've been going on in Dings. I've been there. They're going on now in Illinois. What can we do? What's the future, right, of the Utopias? And are they valuable heritage? Historians and the residents themselves who live there have argued, yes, they are. What's interesting is the people who moved in after, later, right? They call them the Mualai people, the people who bought in later. They don't have the same kind of connection to the house, right? There's a lot of tension in the Utopias between people who are the original residents and the people who moved in later. And there's not a lot of trust there, right? So they didn't grow up and they weren't around them their entire lives the same way, okay? So the people who did grow up that came in later are arguing demolish and rebuild new, right? We want new. And the people who live there and spent their lives there and know that the quality of the housing is better in terms of their thinking, want to then keep it apparent to be a proper urban community. So these are some of the conversations that are taking place. These debates happening in so here's demolition going on in Maine, some of the new housing. But what's great about this, like I said, having these is the sediment in place. People here, they built these houses like literally, I could stand like this to touch them. That's how close they were, right? And then once they were built, they could use them into them so that they can use their community. However, it's slowly different designs and it's stuffy and it's like access, but the community has been kept together, which is for many people from the okay. And then this picture, this is Times City, which is built on the Market famous Market factory grounds, right? So this is what happens when they demolish factory grounds. The rule comes in from Vincom and builds, right, property. So this is the future. The future is much less free, right? The future is not people are used to the same way. Design therapy. So it really asks us critical questions about how do we design people-oriented design that's inclusive, right? And not just providing so wealthy people. Now that land has a value. Remember, on the coast of the mountain had no value. That's an important point. That's why they could build a building so far apart from new spaces. So real quick, thanks for showing us yesterday, Manuel, very similar. I keep saying too. Here we go here. Like, look, where are the green spaces, right? If you get closer, you see they are the Utopias in Hanoi. When you're looking above, go to Google Earth and look from above. And then look, they're all the Utopias. As you go down, right? You see, and there's continue. From above, all the houses there, then you see. Right? That's the and you can see that there's not so planned most times needed, right? The lack of planning, right? That you see in the so we're going to be going to area B here. And again, the Michael Ran model. We have the pool site, right? So we're going to be exploring this area today. This is the original, the ones that were given to the Humboldt. We're going to tour with Mr. Stevens about the original work there. We'll visit the memory house where there's hospital had to for us for community living. Which maintained there, right? And also the North Korean construction that was there. And I want to put something out here. If you guys have never been there, is the, because when these corporations didn't just build housing, they also built the factories and they also built the schools, right? So this is a really interesting nursing school that is the North Korean Viet nursing school. Have some interesting photos of with some family visiting Vietnam. So these kinds of spaces of social friendship that continue to exist in our community today. So check this out if you haven't. So I see that you can see the powerful ways of looking for integrated institutes. So this is where we're going to be going today. And you're going to get this handout. We're going to be doing a sensory mapping of Utopias, where we're going to be doing some stuff with sight and actually more with sounds and smells and textures and of course sight in various sites that we do that. We'll talk to you about after we get there. Okay. Sorry for talking super fast. No, it's not easy to understand for many, my colleagues. But yeah, I got my boys reading outside. Yeah.
I mean, like, this is not for the time.
That's
Yeah,
right.
talk about like every time, like, I think you're confusing.